All right. Wow. Dr. Shah, that is some serious Dr. Seuss like words, my man. Here we go. Let's get the questions rolling. Sorry, the office is a little messy here with all the boxes. Getting ready for the move. All right, here we go. Just love the enthusiasm. We already got these guys. Oh, because you guys probably subscribe. Okay. All right. Just taking questions. Let's get going. I'm going to be live till about 7 o'clock here. Hi, Hassan Khan. Glad you found us. I'm going to be live till 7 o'clock. So, Brophy guys, let's get it going. Tet Offensive was a Vietnam War era North Vietnamese surprise invasion of the South and some of the key southern cities, including cities like Hue City, during 1968. It was during the Lunar New Year, and it came as a shocking surprise to both the South Vietnamese and the American military. But as I always like to tell my students, there's a low probability of military battle questions. So the formats of the DBQ and LEQ, okay? The formatting for the LEQ goes a little something like context, thesis, followed by evidence paragraph number 1. From there, you got to use your 3C skill, and that all depends on which 3C skill you're being asked to do. So if it's change over time continuity, for example, you would go explain either the change over time or explain the continuity. And then you would do your second evidence paragraph and then link that second evidence paragraph to the change over time continuity number 2. And then a good clinching paragraph is to explain how ultimately that topic ties back to another topic in the future. Oh, Hassan. Yes, I remember. Oh my God. Yes. That's right, because so many of these subscribers. Wow. Oh my God, that was a blast. And you guys are in that 7th grade groups in college now. Yeah, the Federalists and the Dem reps in the first party system. Yeah, I would say the Federalists were more on the Hamilton, Washington, John Adams. They were and then John Marshall. Don't forget about John Marshall. They were the main influencers in the Federalist Party early on. So really the distinguishing features that are most germane to apush are the fact that under Washington, you get the Hamilton economic plan. That plan called for a high protective tariff of American industries, sort of aiming to distinguish American industry at the time from European, industries, trying to get that off the ground and running. So it's the high tariff. Number 2, you've got the fact that the federal government was going to take on all that state debt that had been accrued during the Revolutionary War and during the critical period. So that was a revolutionary idea that Hamilton fomented. And then the third part of the Hamilton plan was to create a national bank. And so for Federalists, that and the Dem reps, that was the main partisan issue. There was also, and we got to be very careful. So for all you guys out there, you got to be very careful to not confuse the Federalist Party with the Federalists in the constitutional debate. That is a really critical mistake. They have nothing to do with one another. The Anti-Federalists were not a political party. That was just a divider in terms of the Constitution. And then as far as the sort of Federalist and Dem rep, and so I'll finish up here with the political. So give me time. I know in the chat you guys are coming in. Ultimately, when it comes to the Dem rep party, And the Federalist Party, another issue was the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the extent to which the federal government had control so over states' rights was a major issue as well. The Federalist Party tended to be in favor of big federal government. The Dem Reps tended to favor the smaller states' rights. And then, of course, don't forget that that's how the whole DC compromise came from. So the Federalist Party acquiesced a little bit to the Dem Reps by putting the capital of the nation in the South. The South, right? DC was considered the South back then. Now, going along with the political party, and that ties into Rhett Lindstrom's question here. So after the Fed Dem Rep split, Jefferson kind of went with the Dem Reps, James Madison as well. They were some of the key, James Monroe, Dem Reps. The Dem Reps eventually emerged as the most dominant factor. And that's why that election of 1800 is one of the most important elections in American history, because ultimately that was the first time there was a peaceful transfer of power in American history. And that tradition's been upheld for the most part throughout American history. So as the Dem Rep Party emerged and became dominant, by the time we get to the 1820s, there was only one party left. The Federalist Party had been sort of absolved into the Dem Rep Party. But then comes Andrew Jackson. And so Jackson and the corrupt bargain of 1824 lead to a siphoning of the Federalist Party, the Dem Rep Party. And then the Jackson supporters, they go and merge into the modern day Democratic Party. What happens to the old Dem Reps is they're kind of thrown into chaos because Jackson wins in 1828 and he wins in 1832. So people like Henry Clay, who became kind of the personification of the old Dem Rep, he and John Quincy Adams are left kind of on the outside looking in. And that's when we get the Whig Party coming into form. The Whigs tended to favor Northern interests, industrialization, market revolution, whereas the Jacksonian Democrats were a bit more prominent in the South. Not to say there weren't Northern Democrats. Of course, you had Martin Van Buren in there from New York, but the Whigs are sort of the old anti-Jackson Dem Reps. And the Whig Party and the Democratic Party will go back and forth throughout the sectionalism crisis, 1840s, 1850s. In general, Democrats tended to be a bit more pro-manifest destiny and pro-slavery, although, again, not all. And then by the time you get to the Abraham Lincoln election, remember, Lincoln's the first ever Republican. So the Whigs kind of folded into this new, rebranded, kind of went through a rebrand after some tough defeats to Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. And the Whigs became the Republican Party. So that's where we're at. And then we've had the same parties since 1860. Feudalism, Shamuzi, really? That's more of a European history thing. Feudalism is the idea that tying people to the land. It existed in the pre-American Revolution era in Europe. And when Europeans left and came to the Americas during the 1600s, they were escaping the remnants of feudalism in Europe. So hopefully, Rhett, that and Ford, you guys were on that. Hopefully that gives you a good indication of what's going on with the evolution of the parties. Luck ado. If on the SAQ and DBQ I state a fact that's not right, but kind of the same vibe. So if I see the stamp back, yeah, you're not going to. What I always tell my guys is you don't lose points on AP writing. You only gain points. So when you guys, like I've graded AP essays for years. And so what ends up happening, you start out with basically, 0. And as I go through or we go through the grading, it's like, all right, did they have a context? Yes. Did they have a thesis? Yes. Okay. So there's 2 points. You don't lose points. You got that's kind of the mindset you got to write with. You're not going to get nicked on a trivial detail like the wrong number of a year. Again, where I've gained from grading these over the years, you don't get credit for what you don't write. So if you're not sure on a year, don't hesitate. Just describe what the event was, the development. You're not going to lose points over a year. Now, if the one exception to that is if on an SAQ, it says, briefly explain one development that occurred from 1754 to 1800, and you bring up salutary neglect or the Navigation Acts or Bacon's Rebellion, now you're up Poops Creek without a paddle, because those are going to be outside the time period. So you do have to be aware that the examples you give are within the time period, which is why I keep telling my guys, get on ChatGPT, ask it to create you a like major events document for each unit, and just have a broad understanding of what was going on in that time. Vincent Wang, love the Hooten takeover. What were some of the political scandals that occurred during Grant's presidency? Political scandals are a good, this is the Davins's question. Political scandals are a good sort of benchmark to see for a potential like SAQ. I think those would be like a good SAQ question. I can't imagine there'll be an entire DBQ, like, because you're jumping all over. It's too scattered. But the way and I think that the way you got to look at the scandals is what impact, how do the scandals change the time period? So the Credit Mobilier scandal, for example, was one in the Grant era that made Congress get far more involved in regulating the railroads, because Congress is pumping millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into constructing the Transcontinental Railroad, and it was going to like these phony companies. So that you could argue that kicked in motion events that we know eventually led to the Interstate Commerce Act that came on the back end of the Grange movement. So that kind of ties in. And then the whiskey ring was how some congressmen and government officials were skimming off the top, getting bribed to pass favorable taxes in favor of whiskey producers. And, that ended up leading to a revision of the income tax, which came in the form of the 16th Amendment. So those are the two scandals for Grant. Why that matters in the context of Grant, though, Davins, and to everybody else, that's more important than the scandals themselves, is keep in mind when they were happening. They were happening during the context of Reconstruction. So because Reconstruction was going on, all of a sudden, the Grant administration got riddled with these scandals, and that took a lot of momentum out of Reconstruction. And that's when we ended up, getting the Republican Party to try to buy the White House by selling out to the Democrats for Rutherford B. Hayes to win that special runoff election in the House of Representatives. And as a result, the Southerners were able to eventually come back in a big way, reclaim the South. Those Southern redeemers eventually started winning back state governments and then state federal elections. And then all hell broke loose in the South, leading us to Jim Crow, segregation, Plessy v. Ferguson, and almost a century worth of Southern entrenchment in the South. The context point is really, it's your opening paragraph, KGB. So you've got to give a targeted, put the reader into the time period of the question. You've got to really set the stage for what's happening in and around the time period that the question is focusing on. So let's say I was going to do an LEQ on the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. You would set that up with context from the 1970s. I would suggest going back a decade or so and pumping in not just facts, but weaving a little bit of a narrative about what was happening in that time period that helped set up the question that you're being, or the time period that you're being questioned about. So give a little background, like go to the decade before. So the question is going to be about the Cold War. You got to get into World War II and the whole American isolation to getting involved in the world, the Second World War. And now we're talking about America emerging as a true superpower. So always weave back a decade or so before, talk about what was going on to set up that essay. Is there a curve? Yes, but we don't know it. That's not revealed. Hello, Navtod. Bean Boy, what are the most important likely to show up details of the okay. So post-Cold War, you're going to most likely get things like, the Truman Doctrine, the way the United States handled the Cold War. So containment, domino theory, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the arms race, like those are critically important. The space race, I know that doesn't usually feature too much on the AP exam, but that would be a good offshoot. Marshall Plan, pumping money into Europe to keep communism where it was at. That was a critical part of America's post-war Cold War. The thing that's really important about the Cold War is you got to kind of parse it out and understand it like by president, because each president sort of has like his own way of dealing with the Cold War. So you look at you look at Eisenhower, you look at Kennedy, you look at Johnson, you look at Nixon, right? There's 4 presidents that were tied to Vietnam. Carter, comes out and it gets stuck with the Iran hostage crisis. Oh, and although that wasn't the Soviet Union versus U.S., it was in the context of the Cold War. Reagan, wanted to ram the Cold War back up. Bush, the first Bush, was at the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. So if you know your presidents in that time period, I would run through and just understand how each president kind of navigated the Cold War. And the big ones in there, detente, Nixon to Carter, and Nixon, Ford, and Carter, detente. So that's how I would kind of approach the post-Cold War and then go from there. Why would Hooten guys? It's YouTube. I mean, we're hoping to get like 7,000 people in here, I hope. Populism and progressivism evolve. They evolved in response to the growing and sort of unchecked economies of the United States during the Gilded Age. It was in direct response to a lot of the wealth inequality that grew over time in the United States, primarily thanks to unchecked government, unchecked business practices, growth of monopolies, big business. That was a lot of what was driving the sort of reforms in populism. Populism was chiefly, though, a response from Midwestern and Southern farmers. So unlike the Progressive Era primarily dealt with like urban reforms, environmental reforms, political reforms. And those were driven by things like political machinery, like Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. Those are driven by like the plight of the poor. So people living in, dreary, dank, disgusting apartments. So each era was in direct response. Populism, we talked about it with the Cross of Gold speech and William Jennings Bryan, Coxey's Army were good examples of that. Progressivism, you also get African-American civil rights was in direct response to the sort of growing tensions that emerged in the segregated South. So those are factors driving those as well. Those are factors driving those. Umid, you're giving me like a 200-year window to work with here, man. That's kind of like a crazy. Can you get a little more specific in there? I already did a big thing too, by the way. On those. Random Potato, do you think the conferences like Yalta would be important, Atlantic Charter? Yeah, they're important. They happened during the context of World War II. What those are important for is demonstrating, the way that during the war, the Americans worked with fellow Allied countries. You can't lose track of how, again, battles aren't really that prominent. So what are they going to ask about World War II? Well, a common trend that I've always seen is the industrialization, the factories, women getting more involved in the war. I've never seen a question about the 101st Airborne or the Battle of the Bulge. But the way the U.S. started out with the Lend-Lease program, destroyers for carriers, destroyers and carrier, destroyers for bases, that type deal, like giving money to Russia, the UK, France to fight the Germans. That could come in play. Like the specific conferences. The reason Yalta is important is that's where the Allies laid out their post-war plans. So like the partition of Germany, giving Poland to the Soviet Union, that was just a devastating blow for the Polish people. So yeah, those conferences could matter. I could see that being a question that comes up in a multiple choice. I mean, they're not going to get a whole SAQ on the Yalta conference though. Yeah, so Hadil, I already did that. Let me try to get some fresh stuff. Wow, now I'm trying to catch up here. I see something about Hugh Healy spending more time on watching every Sydney Sweeney movie or TV show appearance ever. She was just in a movie I just saw, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's been out for a while, but she had a minor role in there. Rhett chirping a little bit. No, Akshay, I never do topic predictions ever. Here's the one thing, though. Just remember, the LEQ, there's 3 options. There's 3 time periods, 1491 to 1877. 1865, I believe, to 1945, and then 1945 to 1980. So you got three options there for the LEQ. The DBQ can only come from Unit 3 through Unit 8. So that would be French and Indian War, 1754, up until Reagan, 1980. So you would never get a DBQ on post-Reagan election. You wouldn't get a DBQ on 9/11 or anything like that. So I never do predictions. I have no clue. You can look at all the last couple of years. I think there was one on slavery last year for the DBQ. No, I never do predictions because all that does is get me in trouble. Is the MCQ part of the test in chronicle order? No, roughly speaking, yes. But I wouldn't. I mean, that doesn't usually like. Wow, whoever has this handle, poopy butt too. I wonder if that's Dick Chang. What's the hat mean? 200 Club. Give every letter of the alphabet a number. A equals 1, Z equals 26. And if you spell out a swear word that starts with an F, ends with a G, and then relentless, you get the number 200. The baseball guys know that. Were there 6 different parts of political part? Well, you have Dem Reps, Federalists, then Whigs, Democrats, Republicans, Democrats. So you have 3 sort of sequences of evolution of the 3 political parties. Well, we've been doing 55 minutes and 55 questions all year. So it's a 1-minute pace. So if you find yourself going over a minute, you need to move on. To Dante's question, most important Reconstruction topics. Freedmen's Bureau, that's like the beginning of the welfare state to some degree, because it was a welfare program that the radical Republicans created to build schools, hospitals, infrastructure in the South. So you got to look at the aggressiveness of the radical Republicans. They tried to pass the Civil Rights Act. That was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court. All sorts of money was pumped into the South. You have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. I'd say they're pretty big deals. You got the Reconstruction Acts that divided the South into military districts. You then get the KKK Act, which was an extreme measure by the federal government to crack down on white supremacist groups that ultimately was also challenged in the Supreme Court and declared unconstitutional in the Cruikshank case. You got the rise of those white supremacist groups like the White League, the Red Shirts, domestic terrorism, race riots. I mean, Reconstruction now, I'm not going to make a prediction, but I'm just thinking, if you think logically, for a DBQ or LEQ, right? It's got to be seminal. There's our word. It's got to be seminal topics that are really critical and really prominent. So like Reconstruction would make for a great DBQ topic, a great DBQ topic. No, that is way too broad. And I already did that. That again, I said that to your boy Umid. That's like a 200-year span. And I just covered it again. So the political parties, yeah. Again, Dem Rep versus Federalist. Then it's Dem Rep for a while. And then it's splitting up with the Dem Reps with Jackson. Then it's Democrats and Whigs. They go at it for a while. Then the Civil War comes around. It's Republicans and Democrats. And that's that. Now, again, some of this stuff, I'm getting off here at like 7 o'clock. So Arizona time. So some of this, obviously, ChatGPT will be great to help for. Yeah, I'm not trying to be rude to my guys either. I'm trying to get through as many. Oh, thank you, Maya. I appreciate that. I'm not Adam Smith. I wish I could one day have such a profound effect on the world. Era Good Feelings. That's a good one. That's a sneaky one. That was the DBQ when I was in high school, and I hated it. It is also back when you had to use 10 documents. You guys are soft now. We talk about this sort of, what do you got? You guys are like kind of like not the Harry Potter. You're like the Minecraft generation now. Yeah. So Era Good Feelings. You've got the War of 1812 is over. So the United States is finally done with the Brits. You get the market revolution beginning. So that is critical, right? The growth of transportation, the growth of government investment in infrastructure, the Erie Canal, the Cumberland Road. You get the beginning of the sort of canal to railroad. Like the railroad wasn't really that big though in the area of good feelings, but canals, connecting different parts of the country. You get the growth of the country. So settlers moving further west, the government selling cheap land. You also get like a really sneaky topic that they love. And I mean, the College Board loves, is focusing on this idea of national identity. And so during the era of good feelings, since the British were finally vanquished, you finally get like American culture, right? It's the birth of American pop culture. Hawthorne, the Hudson River School, transcendentalist writers are coming on board. Like Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller. There's questions in the era of good feelings about temperance. And so like that movement starts in. You also get in the era of good feelings, the Second Great Awakening is starting to develop. So there's just this unbelievable crush of change going on, which is why I feel that, again, these are the types of LEQ, DBQ topics you guys got to look for. In what areas are these massive, Shamuzi, massive changes to what's going on? And the era of good feelings represents a whole lot of change. And it isn't always for the best, because as the country is going through the era of good feelings, it's also beginning to expand slavery, especially with the growth of the cotton gin and King Cotton and the market revolution. So a lot of these transitions don't always come with positive. And I think that's what you got to sort of think about when you're framing your arguments about the effects, if it's positive, negative, that's one way you guys can sort of frame your arguments when you're looking at it. How does one cultivate or refine it, actually engage in pre-contextualization? To what temporal should it precede the given prompt in order to establish relevant of depth? Just do the SGA test. When you're making a good outfit, your pants, your top, they have to fit together. If your context doesn't fit, your thesis, it's not going to work. Dante, I guess we could have just said Ishan Patel is a bit OD here. As a little OD. Mueller versus Oregon. That was the ruling that the court basically said, the Supreme Court said that it was not safe for women to work like more than a certain amount of hours. So it was seen as a loss in the women's rights movement, because the courts kind of ruled that women were not capable of working long hours. Environmental factors for Native Americans. Yeah, that would be a good early SAQ topic. Poopy butt. That's on the College Board website where it's been all year. So going back to the question about, oh my God, I'm trying to catch up here. There's just so much stuff. And when people are pumping the chat, wow. All right, so back to Omid here. So with Native Americans, it starts with geography. So the native groups that were closer to oceans fished a lot. That was one of their forms of sustenance. So like your New England native groups, your West Coast native groups, like the ocean provided plentiful supply of fishing, whaling, that stuff. So start with the coastal regions. Coastal regions are also good for trade. Now, freshwater groups that lived in the Great Lakes region, the Mississippi River region, that was one of the most active trade groups areas of the United States. In fact, when I was in St. Louis last weekend, we went off away from the hotel for a little bit on Kentucky Derby Day to watch some horse racing, and we went over into the Illinois side because horse racing is not legal in Missouri. And while we were on the drive, I saw the mounds of Cahokia. What a nerdy apush moment for me that was. Cahokia was one of the most lucrative and well-developed areas in the Mississippi River Valley. So the Mississippi River Valley, other river valleys, lots of trade, cultural diffusion between different native groups was more prominent than groups that lived more isolated, like in Alaska or in the Arctic region, like the Inuits and Eskimos. They were way more isolated. So that geography made them have less contact with other groups. The other, another geographical influence was if you were in warm climates like the desert. So Groups adapted to their environment, like the Anastasies, for example, and some of the tribes out here built their homes into the mountains using natural elements to build their homes, adobe, for example. And then, groups in the plains tended to be more nomadic because the space was more wide open. These are just a little bit of snippets of what you can expect to have to sort of tie. And then, of course, the geography of these regions becomes important when you look at the geography of the colonial developments. And the same goes for like colonies in the South, warmer climates, more humid. Therefore, certain crops could grow and thrive in those areas versus New England, where you're going to get weather affecting and changing the dynamic of crops in a more diverse climate than the South. So I would really focus, if you want to go back to that early material, that does tend to be a pattern that comes up on apush tests of past years, is linking the geography to the development of those regions. Main difference between Gilded Age and Progressive Society. Well, Gilded Age is just the time period. The Progressive Era was within the Gilded Age. So Gilded Age refers to anything basically from like 1865 up until early 1900, and that's where the Progressive Era kind of started at the end of the 1800s. Yeah, Fish needs to impart some erudite words. Send him the link. Effects of the war in 1812. The British are gone. The United States increased its land acquisitions. Another sneaky important thing about the War of 1812 you could bring in, especially if there's a question about like Native Americans, is that it further ruptured, U.S. Native relations, especially because of Tecumseh's War. That was in the context of the War of 1812. But it also sparked like this nationalistic movement I was talking about earlier with the Era of Good Feelings. Major differences between World War I and World War II. That is a quite profound question. One started over in Europe. The other started both in Europe and in Asia. I would say like you got to look at the U.S.'s response to the wars. So in both wars, the United States sat on the bench for a little while and then eventually got involved. We got involved for different reasons. In World War I, we were not directly attacked. The pressure built over time on Woodrow Wilson to get the United States involved. But World War II, you're dealing more with, Pearl Harbor. Again, the causes of the war are important to know. The battles themselves, not. But then, the common theme about World War I and World War II is in the decade after the war, tremendous economic boom and growth in pop culture. The 20s and the 50s are the birth of a lot of pop culture movements. So make sure you go over those and look at that as well. What was the second Great Migration related to? The Dust? No. The Great Migration, the first Great Migration is Puritans moving to the colony, New England, and mostly New England, but also mid-Atlantic colonies. So that was in the 1600s. A big reason for that was the English Civil War. So Protestants were fighting other groups, Catholics, and England was in an absolute like horrible mess at the time. So many Puritans left to come to the colonies. And then a lot went back, actually, but obviously enough stayed. So the second time we referred to the Great Migration, and there's only two Great Migrations. The Great Migration of Puritans to the New England colonies occurred, 1700s. And then the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South during the early 20th century, pre-World War I due to segregation, then after World War I as well. You wouldn't call the Dust Bowlers a Great Migration. That was a migration. You wouldn't call Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans in the late 1800s. That's not the Great Migration. There are only two Great Migrations, Leo. But other migration patterns to be aware of. European migration throughout the 19th century. That's critical. You got to know. And you got to know that like as the centuries moved onwards, more Eastern, Jewish, Russian, Southern, Italian, Balkan immigrants. We also talked about how after World War I, there was a crackdown on immigration. And then after World War II, and going into all the way through the Cold War and Reagan, the growing number of Asian, Latin American migrants, as well as Africans. So, but there are only two Great Migrations. There are only two Great Migrations. I have no idea what Ford is talking about. Sorry. I've covered the Gilded Age quite a bit already. That one is just that is economic laissez-faire, big business, monopolies, tension between uh, little guy, big guy, politics, right? Shifting Democrats, Republicans. There's You guys keep asking me about the Gilded Age and progressive. I've done a lot of that. Let me try to get some more. Um, if being bought, I would not. I'm not regulating that. I would not bring a Monster. My guys know I don't let you drink energy drinks. First Great Awakenings. Okay, First Great Awakening. This was during the era where we talk about what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. So this is the dissemination and the diffusion of ideas from Europe coming into the colonies. Um, Itinerant preachers. They love there's a fiche word. Itinerant, moving around. Itinerant. So moving around quite a bit. Travelers would come to the colonies like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, the OG First Great Awakening guy, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. And so they would preach to masses of peoples. It was really about putting the sort of fear of godless life into you, like trying to revitalize, catalyze more growth of spirituality in the colonies. The one thing to always remember about the ultimate effect of the first, second, third, fourth, whatever Great Awakening is, it's a stronger push to bring Protestantism. These are Protestant movements. You would not funnel Catholicism into the Great Awakening. So it's a reminder that the dominant form of Christianity in American society is and has always been Protestantism, despite the fact we now have Mr. Provost as the newest and only American Pope. Most Americans are Protestant, and that is the remnants of the first and second Great Awakenings. So as America is growing as a colony, stronger relationships to God is critical. And then you get this idea of the expansion of different denominations. So Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, these denominations are going to thrive and grow during the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening comes at a time where this is now the era of good feelings. So it's a truly United States development. And much like the First Great Awakening, it fosters greater connection to God and religion. It strengthens Protestantism within American society. But the difference would be that one is before the revolution, one is after the revolution. The second was bolstered by the transportation and market revolutions. So canals, roads help spread Protestantism into new areas, deeper into the frontier. Don't forget about the burned over district in New York. That was the nickname for that area. People like Charles Finney, he was one of the archetype Great Awakening guys. One commonality between the first and second Great Awakening: universities being developed to train preachers, ministers. So that was a big theme in the first and second Great Awakenings. That would be a good similarity. I like Poopy Butt 2's attitude there. Federal government's control during the 19th century, especially in the beginning during the growth of big business, laissez-faire, hands-off, lack of regulation. There was this prevailing attitude, and a lot of this came from Republican presidents. So people like Ulysses S. Grant, Benjamin Harrison, Rutherford B. Hayes. A lot of the Republican premise was to kind of hands off, let the economy roar. And that became a definitive path for big businesses, railroads, steel, oil, to grow to historic heights of power and wealth. Ultimately, as a result of the unchecked power of these big businesses, state governments began to challenge big businesses in court, and Congress began to rein in some of these big businesses by passing things like the Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. And then you start to see politicians respond to the times. So with the growth of populism, with the growth of progressivism, there became more of a demand for government to crack down on industry and to pass stronger laws protecting workers' rights, consumer rights. Theodore Roosevelt came in as a trust buster. promoting the idea of the protection of the American consumer. So over time, the pressure that was put on the government to intervene, even from muckrakers. Don't forget people like Upton Sinclair, great example of a muckraker who put pressure on reform. As a result of the progressive era, there became a greater demand to crack down on big business. Okay, Esteban, I already answered the Great Awakenings or the Great Migrations, 2 Great Migrations, and there were 4 Great Awakenings. Practice. Oh boy, the chat sometimes it drops me off. Big PKO. When taking any, what happens if it? So normally when you score an LEQ, what happens is like you, as a grader, you're assigned 1 prompt, and you just do 1 prompt for like 500 essays. And so if you get the wrong batch or an essay that was dropped into your folder by mistake, you can actually push the essay to the right grader. All right, I'm trying to catch back up. You said this before. Will there be multiple questions for a single source? Will they be? No, Nicholas, big Nicholas. The way I make my tests is I try to pepper you guys with as much stuff. There will be between 2 and 4 questions per source, 2 and 4 questions, which is why I've said this all freaking year, and you guys refuse to trust me. Our tests are going to be harder than the actual AP. So you like, I can't speak for Coach Hooten's classes. I don't know precisely the level of rigor of your tests. I know that he, pounds you guys with notes and all that. But for my guys, like all year, I give you like 1 big reading patches for 1 question. You're going to get 2 to 4 questions for every single one. Jake VR, difference between the North and Middle colonies. Well, the Northern colonies were more New England colonies. And so that's like Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Vermont was not a colony. Maine was not a colony either. So really it's like Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. So New England colonies were very heavily influenced by Puritans. Smaller farmers, like yeoman farmers, like smaller family farms. Lots of families moved into New England, more so than any other region, because there was more opportunity to develop your own small farm. True or false, was there slavery? Yes, absolutely. There was slavery in the northern colonies, as well as the middle colonies, as well as the southern colonies. It existed all over the colonies, but it was more prominent in the middle and southern colonies because the middle colonies tended to have larger plantation style and also tenant farming. So people could rent land to farm. You had a higher rate of indentured servants in the middle colonies. Now, keep in mind, the middle colonies are places like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York. You got to distinguish the Chesapeake region, Virginia, Maryland. That's more the South. In the middle colonies, the other big distinguishing feature, by the way, shout out JV Baseball for the relentless Yeti. I've got some electrolytes. That's what you guys should load up on tomorrow with your water. Get a lot of electrolytes to help stimulate the brain. Also, remember the Pop-Tart breakfast, only for Apush Nation, guys. Citizens of Hooten Nation, I can't, I'm not going to provide for all of you guys as well. So sorry about that. I mean, you're welcome to come in and hang, but I'm not providing food and sustenance for all of the 10th grade taking Apush. But so it's really going to be for my guys. So anyways, yeah, that's a big distinguishing feature of the middle colonies. A lot more immigration. So Scots, Irish, German, Dutch, a lot of different Swedish, a lot of different groups landed in the middle colonies. The middle colonies also tended to be more religiously tolerant because New England was sort of Protestant, or the Protestant way or the highway. Gia, Eisenhower to limit public fear? I wouldn't say like limiting public fear. Well, Eisenhower stood pretty firm against McCarthyism. He denounced McCarthyism. He denounced partisanship. My guys know Eisenhower is my all-time favorite president. He had one of the highest approval ratings of all time from both parties, Democratic and Republican. If Eisenhower ran today, he would totally be a Democrat. It's just based on the way that politics have evolved. But Eisenhower, had the reputation of being a great orator, great speaker, and his biggest blunder of his presidency is, the sort of Korean War situation. That was part of Eisenhower. He also took a lot of heat for starting up the Vietnam War. But another thing Eisenhower did that you guys should be aware of is response to the Brown versus Board education with the Little Rock Nine, sending in the 101st Airborne. That was a maneuver that Eisenhower did that I guess you could argue that allayed, good SAT word, allay or mollified public fears, because he showed a strength and force when dealing with segregationist people, like the governor of or Orville Flavis, I think was the governor of Arkansas, that he did that. Compromise of 1850, you got popular sovereignty, stricter fugitive slave law. California's a free state. Texas lost some land, but New Mexico was popular sovereignty. And then, the stricter fugitive slave law, though, was the big one that irked a lot of Whigs at the time, because Daniel Webster stood up to support that. All right. Yeah, Ishan Patel is really going hard here. Knocking my golf swing? Wow. That's some gumption. Let's see. I'm trying to catch up here. I like that you guys are kind of helping me out here. When taking any AP, whatever happens if okay, so I already went over that one. Gavin Reddy clapping at Rhett. Colonial Exchange. Yeah, triangular trade is more the economic pattern of behavior, integrating African, European, and American. The Columbian Exchange featured elements of triangular trade, but the Columbian Exchange is more a defined kind of process of cultural diffusion. Syncretism. Don't forget about syncretism. Red Scare? Question mark? Yeah. Red Scare. Two of them. After World War I, when the Soviet Union was first created, and the post-World War I, and then after World War II. So there's a common thread. A world war triggered fear of communism infiltrating the United States. When it comes to the first Red Scare and the second Red Scare, common themes, two things. Well, three. One, fear of communism. Two, government crackdown. Okay, so in the first Red Scare, it was a crackdown of labor unions, especially, and some socialist groups, but labor unions took it hard. That was where you get the Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General right at the beginning of when the FBI was becoming a powerful member of the Department of Justice. And then, the third common trend, because in the second Red Scare, there was McCarthyism and WAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. So that's a common theme. And then the third thing about the Red Scare was there was sort of social activism backlash against it. So like lots of people, artistically, writers, artists, musicians, movie makers, like made a lot of films, books, paintings in response to heavy government crackdown. Man, this Ishan Patel guy, I might have to put this guy in a timeout. I don't know. All these golf questions. I stink at golf. I'm okay. Dr. Shaw loves the real egg is in the sock. Max Wesp, Shamuzi means summer. Difference between the first and second. Oh, okay. Jake VR, that's like way too esoteric. They're not going to get a question like that. But the first Continental Congress kind of organized the committees of correspondence, some of the early protests. And then the Second Continental Congress is the one that declared independence, organized the war, etc. So think second, think war, think, nominating George Washington as the head of the army, writing the Articles of Confederation as well as the Declaration of Independence. XYZ affair was a moment of tension between the United States and France. The French tried to bribe American officials who were on a diplomatic mission to France, and then the United States got really pissed and they referred to them as Monsieur X, Monsieur Y, Monsieur Z, and then that led to a kind of tension, sometimes called the quasi-war between France and the United States. They were never at war, but it became sort of a tense diplomatic time of tension between the groups. And within the XYZ affair, you also get impressment was going on. The British and the French were impressing American sailors. Claire S. I mean, you will not get a 2. That would be. I have more confidence in that. What's more impactful on American society and politics? Eventually, the radio or the TV? I wouldn't compare the two. I would say know how they impacted. So with radio in 1920, immediately it forced politicians to have to use. I mean, both eras, right? The politicians that emerged most popular are ones that manipulated the media. So FDR is probably the quintessential radio president. And then with TV, in my class, we talked about the Kennedy-Nixon debates and, the ability to use the ability to use both in the bully pulpit, to put pressure on Congress to get things done. But I wouldn't say that that's going to be a type of thing you got to worry about. We did look at that one MCQ with the Memphis Blues, right? So both transmit culture. This is a really good point. Both the radio and TV transmit culture in a broader way than ever before in American history. So, radio with music, TV with popular shows, comedies, sports. That would be a good one. Dollar diplomacy versus Roosevelt corollary. Nice question by Vanessa Amato. Yeah, dollar diplomacy was a policy mostly under Taft, but we still use dollar diplomacy. So that's a pretty broad term. The idea of dollar diplomacy is the idea of putting money into countries that you hope are allied with the United States' economics, political goals. So Taft did this quite extensively in Latin America, especially for countries where the United States hoped to gain access to their fruits. And what this led to is often what's called the banana wars, because the U.S. sometimes would send in the military to protect our economic interests on islands throughout Latin America. So to Vanessa's question there, but we still use dollar diplomacy today, so the United States wants to, and if the United States wants to have goodwill in a country, we'll sometimes invest in that country, send aid to that country, to keep an alliance going, to keep the country, in our pockets, so to speak. A good example of dollar diplomacy was in the Marshall Plan after World War II, to keep countries from jumping ship and joining the Warsaw Pact and the communist bloc. The United States funneled billions and billions and billions of dollars. That is a form of dollar diplomacy. Now, the Roosevelt corollary was Theodore Roosevelt's speak softly, carry a big stick, peace through force policy in the early 19th century. It was an extension of that old Monroe Doctrine, which was a warning for European countries to not mess with the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere. So dollar diplomacy is an ongoing way the United States tries to exert its influence on the world. Whereas the Roosevelt corollary, we don't really see that as much anymore. The United States isn't kind of the police force of the Western Hemisphere like it once was. Yeah, no predictions. Why was Andrew Jackson not signing on the Second National Bank so controversial? Well, it was part of Jackson's political agenda. I think if you're, not that you would ever get a question on this, but the comp between like Jackson and Trump is amazingly similar in that both guys just came to the White House with an energy, a passion for their own, politics, and the thing about Jackson in his time period, the thing about Jackson in his time period, again, I'll make this comparison to Trump, is they had their reasons for holding certain um, holding certain politics and certain agendas against. So, like Trump, for example, really wants to crack down on immigration. He really wants to crack down on that aspect of of America. So, similar to Jackson, when Jackson got elected, he, like Trump, came in with it like, I want to kill the bank. I want to get rid of the bank. He saw the bank as an enemy of the people. He saw the bank as an enemy um, of the southern farmers. He looked at the bank as a tool for northern elites to control government. And so Jackson ultimately wanted to sabotage the bank. And he did that by working in tandem with Roger Taney, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. And you should know that name because that was the Supreme Court Chief Justice with the Dred Scott decision. And so together, Jackson and Taney began a plan where they diluted the national bank by moving funds from the national bank into state banks. And then when the national bank collapsed, effectively that triggered a major economic recession, the Panic of 1837, which Jackson left that for his vice president Martin Van Buren. So by killing the bank, Jackson demonstrated his power as the executive, and he was one of the first executives to really take the power of the Constitution and bend it to his wanton political desires. And we're seeing that play out with other presidents throughout time. FDR with the New Deal did the same thing. Trump is doing that in his era. Obama did that during his time period with some of his policies. You can find presidents throughout history doing this, but in the case of Jackson, killing the bank was one of his power flexes. The other power flex was getting South Carolina in line after they formally, declared open rebellion was going to occur in the nullification of the tariff crisis. Now, remember, Jackson was sort of set up by the tariff situation that was passed by John Quincy Adams before he left the White House. But Jackson also was famous for sort of shirking and going against a little bit of the Supreme Court rulings. He famously said in response to one of John Marshall's, rulings, John Marshall's made his ruling, let him enforce it. So Jackson kind of had that sort of bravado with him and his approach to politics. Chinese and Irish immigration. Well, immigration in general is a really common like LEQ, DBQ topic. Both came over in large numbers in the 1830s and 40s for different reasons. Many Chinese came to escape a vicious civil war called the Taiping Rebellion. That's actually one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. Like 25 million Chinese died in that war. And they found work opportunities on the Western railroads, the gold mines as well. The Irish came as a result of various reasons, one of which was the potato famine. And ultimately, right, the goal of each immigrant group was to find a better life in America, but they faced blowback here, especially the Catholic Irish faced a lot of Protestant not Protestant rebellion, excuse me, a lot of Protestant sort of retribution. Catholics found it hard to find jobs and work. That's why Catholics tended to band together in certain diasporas, like in Boston and other East Coast cities. Whereas the Chinese, we know eventually the backlash against them came in the form of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Formation and goals of the Whig Party, Ben Carr. We already kind of covered this. The Whigs were the anti-Jacksons, and they fell apart under the pressure of the sectionalism crisis. I've done, Dhruva, I did so many of the political parties things. So if you roll back the live stream to the very beginning, I don't know if you can do that here, but I've covered that a lot. Um, 8 seminal moments of presidential expansion of power. We already hit a bunch of them, Ford. So let's see, we've got 2 of them: Louisiana Purchase, killing the bank; New Deal with FDR, right? The alphabet soup programs. I would say other ones that come to mind immediately would be Johnson with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in Vietnam. That was a pretty big expansion of power. Andrew Jackson, we got that. Oh, Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation. That was a really strong flex of presidential power. Suspending habeas corpus. FDR with the internment camps. That was a big one of presidential power. Trying to think of other ones that come to mind. Dropping the atomic bomb. That'd be a good example. Washington with the Whiskey Rebellion was a good one. All right, this guy's gone. Yeah, those are good ones, Ford. Yeah, I got it. Sorry, he's gone. Jerk. New Deal terms, we got to remember. Okay, Tennessee Valley Authority would be a good one. That was a government created power company that helped bring power and electricity throughout the South. I think I gave this stat that I read once in this New Deal book I took in college that like during the time of the Great Depression, like only like there was still like 30% of American homes that didn't have running water. Insane. The other New Deal, like you got to look at the all the alphabet soup stuff. I mean, the big ones you can remember, like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Civilian Conservation Corps. The ones that I was bring, the NRA, the National Recovery Agency, and then also the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Those were declared unconstitutional. Don't forget court packing. FDR threatened to add more liberal justices to the court as a result of some of the New Deal agendas being defeated. So that would be a good, New Deal. The Wagner Act supported labor unions. Social Security. Oh my God, that would be a really interesting LEQ, DBQ topic. Is the welfare state? I have really hit that hard in my classes. I don't know about the teachers out there in your realms, but the welfare state, the growth of that really started during Reconstruction, and then during Progressive Era. Eventually, gradually the government started putting together, some programs. But even in the Progressive Era, like settlement houses, the Gospel of Wealth, that was mostly like religious groups, wealthy donors that were responsible for welfare, state governments. But the New Deal changed that forever, and that became like the institutionalized welfare state, with the federal government having mandatory spending programs like the new Social Security, and then eventually and unemployment as well. And then eventually you get like Medicare, Medicaid, like Fair and Equal Housing Act in the Great Society. So that would be something I would really keenly be aware of. Corrupt bargain. There's 2 of them. One was Andrew Jackson losing to John Quincy Adams. The second was during Reconstruction, Samuel Tilden, Rutherford B. Hayes, and it led to the Northern troops being removed from the South during Reconstruction. Okay. Hey, let's. I'm not. This I reported this guy, and now they're being complete jerks. So sorry, everyone having to deal with this. This is I'm trying to ban these guys. Obviously, are being complete jerks with this stuff. Uh, okay, sorry. A little the change in government policy to Native Americans throughout the yeah. So one of the continuities is right the drive to defeat um, Native Americans. So that was a continuity, right? Different eras like pushing natives across uh, the various time periods. It didn't matter. The government made a concerted effort to eradicate the influence of natives. I'd say one of the biggest changes, though, like you have different wars and you have different eras, but the Indian Removal Act, right, marks a defined change over time. So that was when Congress decided, okay, we're going to go in there with congressional force and we are going to eliminate, groups' land. That was a highly important change over time. And then right with that starts the beginning of the reservation system, sort of with Oklahoma territory being given to Native Americans. Now, eventually, right, America became pretty preoccupied with the Civil War and the sexualism crisis. But after the war was over, right, the drive to defeat Native Americans on the plains and in the West was part of winning the West. So we get this whole new era of eliminating Native American groups, abilities to have a defined culture, land, and then the government began to shift more towards that. The government began to shift more towards the assimilation programs. So, like the boarding schools, right? That was a big shift over time with dealing with Native Americans. So, by the time of the post Civil War, you do have wars and battles in the plains, right? The Plains Wars with Custer's Last Stand, and ultimately, though, this move to force Native Americans to assimilate, you had also the Dawes Act, which shrunk even further Native American territories, and that was something that really marked a change over time to by the end of the 1800s, and really this sort of goes with the ghost dance movement. And the ghost dance movement was the culmination of the United States government cracking down on native autonomy. Um, the Dawes Act was the government set aside land that it was going to give to Native Americans, and then what ended up happening was white land speculators, whoever, were buying up the land and therefore reducing the amount of territory for natives. Open door policy was to get the United States more involved in China. Most of the European powers had their spheres of influence. The United States didn't have a sphere of influence, but America was very invested in Chinese trade, especially in the illicit trade of opium. So the U.S. got heavily involved in China in the late 1800s. Development of women's rights reform. Yeah, this is a long journey, right? You got to look at like the colonial era with women, arguing for rights. Women had very few landowning rights, couldn't divorce in many colonies. And then after the revolution, the famous "Remember the Ladies" was the Abigail Adams line. But after the war, there was talk about expanding women's suffrage. Only New Jersey was the only state to allow women the right to vote. And then, as after New Jersey got rid of that, women lost the complete right to vote all over. And so, effectively, what ends up happening to the women's rights movement, there becomes this sort of cultural burden that women are expected to be the next, the mothers of the next great generation of Americans. That's where you get the Republican motherhood trend. Women were confined to mostly raising children, and this continued on through most of the late 1700s, early 1800s. Ultimately, ultimately, what ended up happening for women, a big step to gaining more rights was entering the workforce, and that occurred during the Industrial Revolution, early Industrial Revolution, as well as, excuse me, the Market Revolution. As more women began entering the workforce, they began to see their value within society increase, but yet they were still expected to run the households. And so, as women became more important in the workforce, they began to argue more for equal rights. The equal rights that women most wanted was suffrage, but there was also, this idea of the hypocrisy of the United States in that um, women felt that they were not being treated the same as other minority groups, mostly blacks. And so after the 15th Amendment was passed, there was a big schism between the women's rights movement and African American rights movement. And then women began to really channel their energy into temperance, into suffrage. Um, and as those movements grew, you get like Seneca Falls, you get women challenging the state laws on suffrage. But the ultimate, path to women's rights came with the 19th Amendment. Then we're not in the clear. More recently, in my class, we talked about Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique. So women's rights movement in the 1960s. Don't forget about flappers and that change in the 1920s to the women's rights movement. And then we also talk about the pushback with abortion. That was a key part. The pill, reproductive rights, those debates are key. And then you have to highlight the pushback against the Equal Rights Amendment led by conservative women that were part of that moral majority, Ronald Reagan era conservatism. So those, I mean, I know I'm kind of cramming a lot in here, but and we're getting down to the wire. I got 9 minutes, so I can't answer every question. You guys have been awesome. But Hoop, I mean, I would know the idea of the space race. I mean, you're not going to get like what was the first astronaut to, enter space. You're not going to get a question from Alan Shepard or John Glenn. Isolationist policies affect the Great Depression. Well, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that was the tariff passed during the Hoover era of the Great Depression. That was a sort of isolationist policy. And because America was trying to stay out of European affairs, it wasn't engaged with as much trade. So that would be the way I would say that affected the Great Depression. Yeah, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, I did a long time ago. Annexation of Hawaii. So Hawaii was a exotic plantation-based economy. The United States did not conquer it, but basically the big business leaders teamed up with the military, which is kind of a funky, like Facebook today taking over an island of nations, but basically like with the United States military's help. But yeah, basically the government kind of supported the idea of coercing Hawaii into surrendering to U.S. authority. And then the U.S. gained a very not only profitable plantation, economy, but also like the forward operating naval base. That goes back to that Alfred Thayer Mahan about strategy of strength through the Navy in the late 1800s. And the U.S. wanted to get more and more into Asia. Between the ideological faction, the Federalists, and the later official party. Yeah, Federalists always associate with strong federal government, tariffs, Hamilton's economic plan. Those would be good things. And the LEQ for your thesis should provide. Yes. You should always have specific to LAIF. I always suggest to my students, like, identify your argument and give at least 2 or 3 reasons that would support the argument. And you go into more detail in the evidence. Frederick Jackson Turner thesis. That's viewed now suspiciously. I would say that, like, if that was written today, the woke mob would come after Frederick Jackson Turner because he really fomented this idea of manifest destiny, like being a big part of winning the West. And he kind of saw the West as the extension of this American democracy spreading. I think people today would look at that a more critically lens because, of course, with the spread of American democracy west, which he wasn't wrong, but that led to the devastation of Native Americans throughout the West. Jacob Hooper, the DBQ has to come from 3 through 8. Has to. That's on the College Board website. Talked about you guys that. LEQ, there are 3 different LEQ options. So just Google it. AP US History Exam Breakdown. It has everything, including percentages of multiple choice. Like, did you know Unit 1 is only 4 to 6% of the exam? So you're only going to get one probably question from Unit 1. Because if you're 5% of 55 questions, it's probably going to be 2 to 3 questions. So that's about, what I can say about, knowing the scouting report of the exam is important. Gavin Reddy, that is too much. There's too many presidents for me to go through every doctrine. So I'll just Truman Doctrine, stop communism, contain communism, get after communism. Great Society was Lyndon Johnson's liberal reform to increase the welfare state. If you want me to go over other presidents, just give me some specific ones and maybe I can crank those out. Market revolution, transportation, industrialization, cotton gin, steam engines, canals, right? Henry Clay's American system. It's the growth of a standalone American economy. Important tariffs, tariff of abominations that came in 1824, Hamilton's tariff, which was one of the early things, and then Smoot-Hawley tariff. I mean, there's tariffs are ingrained in American society, but don't think the College Board, just because of the tariff stuff going on now, is going to all of a sudden ask, like, this exam was written over a year ago. So, but in your essay, could you reference how tariffs today remain a central part of partisanship? 100%. So you can use current events if you can tie it to the historical events, and that can help you with the sort of complexity point. That's not a bad idea. I've gone over a lot on the Gilded Age earlier, so Lauda. So if you back it up once I publish the live stream and you go back to like the first 30 minutes, I covered a lot on the Gilded Age. Labor, okay, Wagner Act in the Great Depression, also the Fair Standards Act. So the Wagner Act gave labor unions more rights. The Fair Standard ended child labor. Those are 2 really important. With labor, you got to remember the government started out with like anti-labor, like labor unions could even form. Gradually, labor unions came around. There was a ruling in the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth v. Hunt, that allowed labor unions to exist in Massachusetts, and other states began allowing it as well. Over time, the labor unions began to gain more rights, especially during the World Wars and Great Depression, because of the fact that the government needed the labor unions on their side. And then after the New Deal, that's really when labor unions became cemented within American society and seen as more of a, well, for some, a positive tool. Others, more conservatives, don't tend to appreciate the role of labor unions. But, labor unions, that's good change over time. Go back to all the tension between the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor. They were tied often to anarchist groups, socialist groups. The Haymarket Riot was a real dent into the labor union movement. So there was a long-standing tension in the late 1800s between labor unions and big business. That was a key theme in the Gilded Age. And then the Great Depression changed the perception of labor unions forever in America, making labor unions more critical. I mentioned in my class Ronald Reagan with the firing of the air traffic controllers was another labor union moment, but there's more of that. Druva, I went over Era Good Feelings a while back, my man. So American Identity, American Business, the Market Revolution that's going on in the Era Good Feelings, the Dem Rep domination, those are key themes. Japanese internment, it was seen as a necessity. It was challenged in the courts, and the United States government upheld the usage of the internment camps as a wartime emergency. Sounds good, Vincent Wang. Yeah, I'm going to hop off in about 2 minutes, so this might be a good time. What caused labor unions to decrease? Association with anarchists, association with anti-government, anti-business. So it's that trend that they were typically more against the business practices. You're welcome, Jacob. Thank you. Mitchell, Progressive Era Presidents and Impact. Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Woodrow Wilson were the big ones. So each of them had their own sort of agenda: trust busting, conservation of natural resources, reforms to government, especially like political machines. Taft, and Wilson. I mean, remember, with the presidents, it's not always the presidents. It's Congress has to pass the laws. Basics of Korean War. Truman used the United Nations to send American troops to stop communism. That would be the best thing I would say about that. I love the positive vibes. Sorry for those jerks that were being so uncouth, very rude behavior. Yeah, I appreciate it all. I'm not going to give some big fiery speech. Most relentless of all time. Thank you, Ford Vaco. Max Wilson, Double A. You guys have been great all year. I'll see you tomorrow for the Pop Tarts if you want. Again, you're not compelled, my guys. Yeah, the apush guys. We'll have plenty of time next week. I wish we had more time, but I appreciate you guys, coming into the live stream. So I'm gonna end the live stream here and end the chat. It's been awesome, guys. Thank you so much for coming in, and I will see you all. Yeah, very uncouth comment. Yeah, sure, no problem. Izzy sucks. You're welcome. All right, I'm gonna end this. So good luck, guys. Past shapes future. Let's do it. Oh, trying to end the